Hey, Nikki.
Hi. Hi, Heather. Do you recognize me? I'm the person that always says hi to you around the lake and at Whole Foods or at Lucky's.
Hey, Vicky.
And I trained with your daughter in Brazil.
Right, right. You did
Yeah.
your movement training there, or your rocking training?
I did it both. So this was almost
Yeah,
close to 20 years ago when you could do the dual certification.
right, right. She promised long ago that she'd move back to the United States sometime, but I doubt if it's ever going to happen.
It's funny. It sounded like you almost, when you were saying rough movement, you almost said you're patterning.
I know because I've been going back and looking at all of this stuff, and patterning popped right out of my mouth. But
Well, that's great because I was just speaking to someone and they said hello to you, and that was Judith Ashton.
no kidding.
Yeah, I just had a little small phone call with her, and I said I was going to be seeing you. And she didn't know Heather Starsong, but she knew Heather Wing.
Yeah. Well, I've had a few names in my life.
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
a lot of gratitude toward her. What a gift she gave me in this work that I love.
Well, I'll say then, Heather, I'm so grateful, even though we only had one session together in your basement. It was such an amazing session. And I had been struggling with Rolf movement before that. I had really been trying to figure out what is Rolf movement because at the Institute, they talk about it, but depending on the teacher you have, you get a different sort of thing. And I had done a class before and I didn't connect with that teacher. I didn't really get what we were trying to do in that program, and I left being like, and then I did a session with you, and I left being like, I want to be a Rolf movement practitioner. It was,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm grateful for you.
All right.
I would love to know a little bit more of the history. I would love to hear a little bit more about your history with Rolf movement and how it's come into your life. And then I'm slightly fascinated with how you birthed a Rolfer and Rolf movement practitioner, where Layla's gone and done her thing. So,
Yeah. Well, I think I should actually start by just saying that Ida always talked about, now, see, I knew Ida. I didn't sit in class with her, but my husband, Tom Wing, did. And he downloaded every night to me from class. So that was really, really exciting. And I feel like I learned a great deal. I feel like Ida is one of my main teachers. She always insisted that Rolfing was education and that movement was really important. And unfortunately, she had a fairly Martian approach to movement, like head up, waistline back, elbows out, and that kind of direct command didn't work very well. People made people tense, but she knew that. And so she started early on getting people to help her. And the first one was Dorothy Nolte. And Dorothy Nolte trained with her in the late 50s, and then during the 60s developed something she called structural awareness, which was the first movement process based on Rolfing principles. And she worked with Ida on that. And when I met Dorothy Nolte in 1970, I had gotten my first 3 sessions at Esalen. And then I came back we were living in Del Mar down near San Diego, and I drove up to Los Angeles to get the rest of my work from Dorothy. And when she told me about the movement work, my ears just pricked up. But then she said, well, you can't do it unless you're a Rolfer. So I was kind of discouraged. But then later, I heard about Judith Aston. She trained with Ida in the late 60s. She was a movement facilitator for Gestalt therapy, and she was a dancer. And she and she did some work with Dorothy, but she sort of took over the movement work then. And she and Ida called it Rolf-Aston Structural Patterning and Stillness and Motion. That was the name of the discipline at that time. And I trained with her in 1974. And part of the training was we needed to take a full audit. In those days, we had the audit and practitioner, which maybe you remember with that. Was that before your time?
And before our time.
Yeah.
Before my time.
It was before, yeah. Well, it ended sort of in the late 80s. We started experimenting with different ways of doing it. But anyway, I audited with Emmett Hutchins that fall of 1974, and then early in December went to, where did we have that? Somewhere in just north of San Francisco. And I had my first training with her then, and trained with her for the following 2 years. She had 3 or 4 trainings, I can't remember exactly, until she split from the Rolf Institute. She and Ida, I remember the last training I was in, sometimes we'd meet in the evening and she would be in tears after having talked with Ida and felt not understood. Anyway, they came to a parting of the ways in 1977. And I guess that seems not so long ago, but I guess you guys weren't part of it yet then. But it was, pardon?
I wasn't even born yet then.
I was born in 77.
You were born in 77. Okay, yeah. I forget sometimes. The years seem to so come together. But anyway, it was like a divorce in the community. And, like our parents, Ida and Judith, had a divorce. So it was heavy. And then later we had the guild breakaway, but the first breakaway was Judith. And she became very, if you're going to stay with the Rolf Institute, then I will no longer be your teacher, was her words. But there was a big gap because she'd been teaching very effectively what we called lead-in movement classes before the practitioner training, with a lot of focus on how the practitioner used their body and how that affected the quality of their work. And so when she left, there was this gap. And Roger Pierce, I don't know if you've ever known him, but he now lives in Longmont, not too far away. Roger Pierce and Gail, now Rosewood, and I started teaching the lead-in trainings. And that was very exciting. 3 of us worked together really well. We were fast friends. And Roger, they would come and stay with me, and then we would go over to the Institute because we lived near the Institute then and teach. And so that was sort of the beginning. And then there was a time when we gathered all the patterners who didn't go with Judith. They all came to my home. I invited them. They came from all over the country. We shared the travel expenses, and we hung out together for quite a few days. And it's a long time ago now. It was 1978, I think. But we shared our ideas, and we dreamed up how we could create a movement program for the Rolf Institute. It was exciting times. And then for a couple of years, we had what we called movement exchange workshops, where we would get together and exchange what we were learning and what we were doing. And sometimes we'd have other teachers came, and we had Dorothy Nolte come in and teach. No, not Dorothy. Her student, Rachel Harris, came and taught. And then in one of those, I met Emily Conrad and learned about Continuum, which has been a really important influence for me. So that's some of how it started.
Heather, can you talk about the kind of the style that you have made crafted after when Judith had left, and then that in between time before you met Emily, when you and these group of people were together creating your ideas? Could you describe it or name it?
I would say that
is?
My work is based in Judith's work in those years that I studied with her. And she had, I think one of her most brilliant things was getting a hold of how important it was for the Rolfer to use their body well when Rolfing. And I've done a lot of work, even recently with Rolfing students here, teaching them how to use their body so that they use weight and not force, which makes all the difference. If you use weight, it's a more penetrating touch and doesn't cause pain. So in those early years, I used to go into the classes and try and guide the Rolfers in the practitioner training to use their bodies skillfully. And it was hard. They would give me a lot of static, like, leave me alone. I'm just trying to get this Rolfing. I'm going, no, you're not going to get it that way. And I can remember even watching one of the assistants, I forget who he was now, working during a 6th hour, just leaning his elbow into somebody's buttock and going, loosen up. And of course, they didn't. So the basis of my work is from Judith, but hey, I've been doing this for 45 years. And
so for clarification, when Rolf Movement was in the beginning stages, would you say it was more about the Rolfer learning how to work more efficiently opposed to teaching a client how to?
No. That was only one aspect of it. We were all working with private clients, and we taught our first training in 1979. I taught it with Megan James, and we had developed a Rolf movement training that had 2 phases, actually 3. We had a selection workshop. We weren't happy with the way selection committees were working in those days, because the people would just come in and sit down in front of a row of Rolfers and they would decide in half an hour whether that person could be a Rolfer or not. So we had a week-long selection class, and in that class we taught the work. We saw how they responded. We had them practice teaching things. I remember one innovative young woman teaching us all how to get your bra off without taking your shirt off. Hillary King, she was wonderful. And then we had a training in which we worked with each other. It was built like the Rolfing training. We spent our morning in the Rolfing class across the hall auditing the lecture and demonstration. And then we spent the afternoon working with each other, and I have still a program of tools that we would teach and practice with. And then the 3rd phase of the training, we had outside clients come in and work with them. So the work with the Rolfers was just a small part of what we were doing then.
So as you were after Judith had left and before you found Continuum, you were bringing other things into it as well, or was it more
Not so
sort of
much. What I started to say was, Continuum has been important, but I'm not teaching Continuum when I teach Rolf movement. I've pulled a few pieces out of it, particularly the micro movements, which I work with. They work as a solvent for pattern. If somebody's head is locked into a certain position and you get the micro movements going, then other options start to emerge, and the sort of this is the only way feel of the pattern can begin to let go. But I also started to say that 45 years of teaching Rolf movement, it's a long time, okay? And many times clients come up with problems that the tools I have won't handle, so I make up new ones. So my work is based in what I learned from Judith, but it has evolved from my own experiments and explorations over the years with the people that come to me and
That's
teach
beautiful.
me. Yeah. I mean, I had one session with a young man who was really tense, and I tried all my tricks and they weren't working. But he was a professional Frisbee player. And finally I said, okay, let me see you throw that Frisbee. And we had a pretty big backyard in our house at that time. So we went out in the backyard and I watched him throw the Frisbee. And every time he pitched it, he would do this huge grin. And I looked at that and went, oh. So we came back in and I worked with his face, and everything let go. He had his professional face and that smile that was frozen on there, and it tied up his whole body. So then I developed a whole session on working with faces, which I haven't done for a while, but it was quite effective and fun. And so
if you want to practice that again, we can have another call. I'm happy to do some work to help you get it back up and running.
Yeah, well, I think I remember it okay. Yeah. So that's sort of my answer to what my work is now. And it's still evolving. I mean, you learn a whole lot by just practicing. And
so you've had a lot of years of practice, but could you share a little bit of the magic, the secret sauce of where do you go and tap into to find your new skills to work with let's say the challenging client who has that fixed smile on?
Well, let me see, how do I say this? So we Rolfing movement teachers have, we have a sort of a toolbox of different movements, different exercises that work to, say, shift the way the shoulder moves with the arm and things like that. That they're exercises in awareness and in shifting pattern. But all of those tools just slide over the surface if you don't get down to what the pattern is. And that's so, I don't know if all your listeners know what I mean by pattern, but I'm talking about, it's sort of the basic way that a person expresses in the world. And it's shaped by birth and by how you're handled as an infant and how you relate to your social groups, starting with your family. And then, you want to walk like the lead girl in school, or you want to, swagger like the tough guy that's the football chief or something like that. And so their patterns are shaped by what you do in your life. I was very much shaped by studying ballet as a young girl. Unfortunately, I had to overcome a lot of that. And also we're shaped by trauma, by injuries and illnesses and abuse, all different kinds of things. And so a lot of our patterns are fear-based. Some patterns, when I'm talking about the person's pattern, it's really a conglomeration of patterns that overlie and compensate. You understand this, I'm sure. And it's a lot of these patterns are fear-based. And some of them work very well. Some of the ways we're doing things work very well for us, and those aren't the ones we need to worry about. But when the client comes in, it's so important that we listen and pay attention. And I was going to talk some about what Rolf movement was, but one of the things that's really important is the finding of the neutral space. And the neutral space is where everything's, the basic idea is everything's aligned. And when it's aligned, we have lift. And we also have this dynamic balance point where nothing's hanging out into gravity and being pulled down. Everything's supported by what's underneath. And when we get to that space, we have the saying, somebody has an attitude. You know what I mean? And so it might be a cock of the head, or it's an emotional thing, the way they talk. It's part of the pattern. And when we're in neutral space, we lose our attitudes. And that means that we're available to connect in a way we can't when we're, say that I'm listening to so I want to find out about this pattern that this person comes in with. Part of it, I watch them walk. Can tell a tremendous amount about what's going on with someone by the way they walk. But also there's a conversation. And in that conversation, I want to be listening from neutral space. If I'm too far forward, I might be giving the message, this is an attitude. Okay, I'm going to fix you. I know what to do. I'm on top of it. And that might be intimidating to the client, and they might not feel that you're listening. Or you might be, hanging back in the chair, talk away, but I don't really care. You're giving that message. So when you're in neutral space, you're giving a message of presence. And then that's listening in that way is an expression of love. And over the last 20 years, it has grown stronger and stronger for me that we need to work with love. And if we create in our studio a environment of unconditional love, then miracles can happen. We need skill, no question. And I'm, definitely wanting everyone to develop their skill, but skill without love is a cold thing. I've experienced it. I mean, there's Rolfers I've been to that I felt were pretty skillful, but I didn't feel their caring. I didn't go back. What I'm saying here is then the first thing is to discover that pattern and to discover it in a field of love and support. And then, as I say, many of the patterns are fear-based. And it takes courage to let that come out and to let go of the pattern of defense that we may have to find another option. So I told you I studied ballet as a little girl. I also had some tough stuff in my childhood. And I was arched and head up, back arched, chest tight and high and head up. And I, talk about an attitude. And I gave long messages to people. They called me stuck up and snooty, but I was scared is what it was. And my relationships changed drastically in proportion to how I slowly let go of that arched back and held chin and so forth. So this work is so transformative and important. I've wandered a little bit.
Well, I wanted to kind of anchor in from, because like I said, I studied with your daughter and Monica Kaspari. And one of the things that your daughter said to me, and I was, Rolfing was one of my first careers. And so I was in my early mid-20s. And she, in one of the training, she had said, a lot of the things that serve us can be also a disservice. Yes. Or things that serve us can also be limiting, or things that are limiting can also be serving. And I thought, and that was kind of said in talking about our histories, our patterns, things that we've taken on in our lives. And I thought that was so profound. And like the kind of simplest thing is when we shrug our shoulders, we do it out of fear, and that's very serving, but it's not something we want to stay in, and that would become limiting. And when you were talking about holding this neutral, what I kept on hearing too, and then you anchored it to love, is like holding into the balance of kind of the things that are working for us and the things that aren't, and then finding that medium of not completely abandoning our history and what's kind of made us who we are, but also coming into what's going to serve us and kind of stay in this neutral, loving space.
Yeah, right. Well, as I say, some of the patterns that we have work well. What we're working with is the ones that get in our way, that limit us. Mm-hmm. And fear is limiting. And as we can, Ida had a larger vision even than helping people to find a body that balances well in gravity. She was also believing that this work was evolutionary. She talked about the upright man, and man meant everybody in those days. She was before women's lib. But she really had a question, an inquiry about if we get rid of the obstructive, limiting, fear-based patterns, if we can start to remove those, then can we perhaps as a humankind also let go of our habits of worrying and territoriality and greed and become heart-based? And looking at where we are now, we need a change. And I feel like our work is more important than ever because we're person by person, maybe class by class, bringing people into a way in which they can be more connected. I've been very, very touched by the work of Charles Eisenstein. Are you familiar, either of you, with his work?
He's the like embodied ecology. Is that him?
Yeah, I think that's the book I read that I loved was The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And he talks about the story of separation, which is I'm alone in this world. if I don't get mine, you'll get it, and there won't be enough, and I won't be okay kind of separation, which is basically the story we've been living out of for the last several millennia. Some exceptions. And the story of what he calls interbeing, which is he believes our only salvation at this point is to begin to understand that we're all connected. And I feel like as we are, and I lived through the 60s. I was a young woman in the 60s. And that was a time of such hope because there were a lot of threads of interbeing coming forward then. Communes, let's live close to the earth. Let's share. Let's take care of each other. Very different from, the capitalistic, how much money can I get out of this approach? And make love, not war. That was our cry, And a lot of that got lost, but it's still around. And I feel like Rolfing and a lot of the New Age work is a lot of the New Age potential kind of human potential work that was so alive in the 60s and 70s is still around, but it's gotten a little bit smothered by some other things that are going on. But here we are with our riots over racial inequality and racial violence. Time to wake up and realize we are all connected and we need to have our hearts open to each other. And I think we're helping with that with Rolfing. So I'm excited about that. And excited about all of you who are coming along after me and doing that, including my daughter. And Lael, your work with Lael, Nikki, she's very much a Hubert Godard follower. Mm-hmm. In fact, they are fast friends. Every time she's in Europe, she spends time with him and she adores him. And I think it's mutual. And I know little of that. I think I wrote you that, Andrew. I've met the man and experienced some of his work, but I haven't learned it. So you'll have a different kind of movement experience with Lael than you will with me, but it's still toward the same goals.
Well, I don't know if it's just when I studied or my memory retention or what it is. I mean, it could be a little bit of everything, but often people ask me, because I spent some time teaching part of the phase one and at the Rolf Institute. I haven't been there in a couple of years, but for about 5 years I was part of the phase one team. And there was this kind of confusion of what is Rolf movement? What is Rolf movement? And when they would do sessions with me, because often people would come and do privates with me, and if there is some truth to when you've done it enough, you kind of just start cultivating your tools. And then on top, and with that, I'm trained in many modalities. So I've borrowed from concepts from Pilates, gyrotonic, yoga, other things. And, but it's been a little fascinating for me to kind of see where Rolf movement is. And when there's particular principles that are now spoken about, because my recollection, and also because at the time, the Brazilian training, the structural and the movement were really intertwined. So it's hard for me. It's not like we had a break necessarily. I mean, we definitely had chunks of time that were Rolf movement, but it was always constantly talked about. So I feel my training is a lot just been a somatic awareness. Mm-hmm. I mean, the tonic function was talked about. I don't remember it being a very heavily influenced, and maybe it is now, or maybe I missed that point and just kind of took what I needed to learn. But about 20 years ago, but I definitely had heard of Hubert and his influence, and there was a lot about organization with movement, with the gravity that he talks a lot about.
Well, I have been sitting here in my studio working with Rolfing students coming for movement sessions, and I've heard a lot of confusion, which has made me sad. And so I want to just say I have very definite principles of what I'm working with, and they're Rolfing principles. I mean, the basis of Ida's work her aha was how the body relates to gravity makes a difference. And so her principles of support and alignment, I mean, these are the principles that I work with. First of all, our structural work is to put people together so that the feet are under the legs and the legs are under the pelvis and the pelvis is under the torso, which is under the head. And then the body is aligned. And the core, which is, I think Ida borrowed right straight from yoga. I'm a yogi too. I've been practicing since the 60s, a long time, and still. And the core then becomes straight so that the energy can move through. And so how do we then move out of these principles? I mean, I had one student come in and say, my Rolfer finished the session and I stood up and they said, beautiful, don't move. So then this obviously isn't very practical. So in Rolf Movement, then we're looking to support action, which means using the rocker principle, putting the foot under the torso when you're stepping forward and putting the foot under the torso when you go to pick something up, for instance. Not fighting gravity when you sit up from the table, but rolling to the side, working with gravity. And then when we have the alignment, then I play a lot with what I call balance point. It's a point where you are your lightest and where we have this wonderful possibility that we have in Rolfing of lift, where gravity no longer pulls us down. When we're like out of alignment, then something's hanging out where gravity can pull on. I remember Megan James saying, gravity's like a monster under the floor, waiting to pull on something. And as soon as you get it where it doesn't support it, then, and I'm around a lot of older people now because I am myself. And many of them now need walkers to support the unsupported parts of their body. So that's very important. And then the finding of neutral space, which is a place of peace. You're not struggling with your attitudes anymore. And I practice meditation, and it's sort of like the place of meditation. Then the next principle is the core. And that's bringing awareness to the center, literally physically centering yourself with breath and with movement, and then learning to move with what I call integrity of movement. The whole body participates in the direction of intention. So if I'm working at the table and I have my butt sticking out behind me, then my torso is no longer supported and all my pelvic energy is going behind instead of into the person. So keeping that alignment as we work, for instance, and working off the toe hinge, using weight instead of muscle, is another way that we can talk about moving from core. Or if I reach out to shake hands, remember shaking hands? Kind of gone now. But if I reach out to shake hands and I'm putting my arm out with the intention of saying to this person, I'm glad to meet you, but if at the same time I'm taking my chest away, the message is, well, here's my hand, but I really don't care.
If only you could teach Donald Trump about that, it would be so wonderful.
Donald Trump. Yes, pray for him. Okay. Anyway, so that's another learning to move from core, bringing your whole self to what you're doing. I had this student early on. He's a young man. He was one of Lael's boyfriends. He now lives 2 doors down, and I see him walking his dog. We still remember each other. But it was in the early 70s, and most people didn't have computers. And he got a job with a computer. And he came in for a movement session saying his back hurt. And so I said, well, show me how you sit at the computer. And I moved my desk aside and gave him a chair. And he turned sideways to the desk, and he put his feet on one end. And then he said, the computer's over here. And then he twisted his body around. Most of him was facing that way. Twisted his body around so that he faced the computer. And I said, well, no wonder your back hurts. Here now. And I set him up facing the computer and putting it in front of him. And he said, I don't want to give all of myself to that computer. And he quit his job. But that's a case where he wasn't bringing his whole self to what he was doing. He didn't want to, and it was totally in his posture, and it hurt. So bringing your whole body in the direction of intention makes your walking easier if you're not dragging your upper body behind you. If your upper body's on top of your pelvis, for instance. And then the next really important piece is fluidity. And here's where I bring in a lot of the continuum work. That's where I've been very, what we call responsiveness, that awareness of the fascial web, everything, you know what I mean by that, all the connective tissue, being this resilient three-dimensional web that we're working with. And Ida said, the arches breathe. And we know we don't have lungs down there, but what she's saying is that even the breath should move all the way through the body without restriction. And of course, because of our fear patterns, we have lots of restrictions. And wherever there's a restriction, or it has, say someone sprained their ankle and it healed in a twisted position, then the movement doesn't go through to that ankle and the person starts to limp and compensations accrue. And, or one of the most common ones is the neck being held when you breathe. And then there's neck pain. So when the ripple of movement comes along and hits a still place, it creates an impact, and where the impact is, there can be pain. And often then it spirals because you're in pain, and then you hold your neck even more, and then the pain gets worse. So that's a place where I would use the micro movements to soften the rigidity of the neck. One of the ways I think about what we're doing in Rolfing and Rolf Movement is we're melting the body armor and letting it become, not throwing it away, but melting it inward to become fluid strength at the core. So those are some of the principles. I have a list here I was making. I think I said them all. Yeah. Those are some of the principles that I work with, and I feel like they are the principles that I work with structurally and also with movement. Does that connect for you, Nikki, with what you're...
I think it does. I think I find the principles of Rolfing has been, that's the guiding light to create structural integration, whether you're doing the 10 series or non-formalistic series or sessions or Rolf Movement, is creating support, adaptability, palintonicity, closure, trying, and coming back to that, the love piece is meeting your client where they are, really respecting that they're maybe coming in with edges and trying on different patterns in a very titrating manner. So it becomes, they get to own it by trying it on little bit by little bit and not like a brute force within the tissue or a brute suggestion of like, no, you got to do it this way. So,
I think that's so important that we don't, this Rolf movement is not fundamentalist, okay, the one and only right way to do it, but rather that we present it as options. And when we get stuck in a pattern, particularly a fear-based pattern, we're probably unconscious of it. And then the first step is finding the consciousness. Oh, when I lean back like this, it puts the whole weight of my torso into my lumbar spine. No wonder it hurts. But it's also, when we look at it as an option, there's times when sometimes those old patterns are what we need. Say you're in a gathering where the vibrations aren't so good. Well, then maybe pulling back a little and crossing your arms across your chest is the right thing to do. So it's not like you're saying, throw it away. I worked recently with a young woman who, I forget what it was, but she was in a situation where she was getting hit all the time. So her neck was like, and I think it was a fighting, I think it was some kind of organized something where she was getting hit all the time. And no wonder her neck was tight. And I said, yeah, if somebody's clobbering you, tighten your neck. That's going to keep you from whiplashing. But when somebody isn't clobbering you, let it go. And the ballet dancer definitely wants to be able to turn her feet out when she's dancing, but walking that way really doesn't work as well as having them go straight forward. So it's options. Like when you're dancing, okay, do that big turnout. When you're walking, see how it feels to roll through your foot instead of falling off the medial arch. So I think it's very important that we see it as options, and that we let our clients know that, yeah, you have this pattern for a reason.
Totally.
And is that reason still here? You know, and a lot of times we're looking at patterns. I think you mentioned this, Nikki, that they're old now. You know, the 2-year-old boy standing up, sticking his chest out, sticking his butt out and saying, no, that's a really important step in his process. Right?
I think Nikki can relate to that more right now.
I have a couple boys grown up now. But if he keeps that stance when he's 35 and he's trying to relate to people in the business world, it's going to be off-putting. Not going to do something. He's probably going to have a backache by this.
I was going to say, I mean, what you say is a lot. It took me a while to get there, but of really trying to educate my clients when they say I have this problem or I'm sitting this way. For me, telling them this pattern has served you. It did it to protect you. It did it to help you. It doesn't need to still be there. If it's not ready to go, don't have animosity towards it. Recognize it, have love to it, but recognize it. It doesn't have to be there. But it wasn't bad. It served and can still serve a purpose.
Go and pick it up again.
Totally.
Yeah. And those patterns that they come in with, I say, though, don't worry, you won't lose it. You know that one really well. But maybe you want to try something else in this situation.
Yeah.
And so that's a very important part of the loving environment also.
And that optioning, when I first started teaching yoga, we taught or we instructed, we didn't offer. And it was very much the teacher knows and everyone follows the teacher. And that's how I did it because that's how I was taught. And then slowly through different education models, I started to understand how would it feel like if you did this and giving the offering to. And it's funny because a lot of people I would teach didn't like that because they weren't familiar with that model. They wanted to be told what to do. They wanted to go into patterns even if it didn't serve them because they hadn't, I guess, maybe built that awareness up. And it takes time for some people to get used to that, you know, I'm actually in control of myself and I can take that. So I love, like what you said, that giving options and offerings is so important.
And that was from Judith. She was way into that. Yeah. It's exciting that you talked to her. I've been completely out of touch. I don't know how she is or anything. So,
you know what? You both have this thing about you. And so people who are listening, maybe they can hear it. But it's one of the things I was mentioning to her. There's something about people who do the work. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to have you, besides to share your amazingness, is when people do the work. That a lot of people, I've met a lot of teachers who preach the work, who talk about the work, but maybe don't necessarily follow through or the same. And there's no judgment and there's, but when people do the work, there's something about them. Everything you mentioned there about the principles of your Rolf movement, I'm recalling in my memory of watching you instruct and move across the room. And I remember when I watched you in our session thinking, this is what a Rolf body is, because you floated across the room, but you weren't airy. You had a connection to the earth. You were strong. You were buoyant. You had this sort of everything going on. Like if I wanted to push you over, it would be hard. At the same point, if I just lightly touched you, you could also respond in this way. It was you had your feet on the ground, your head in the sky, your heart forward, your back behind you. Everything was there was a fluidity there. It was all that. So everything you said, I can recall watching you and even seeing you now just across the screen is like, it's very clear to me that you practice what you preach. And it's very, and similar with Judith, just speaking to her briefly, and I've watched some of her videos recently. There's something about the both of you of having done the work and continuing to do it that is humbling.
Well, it's my lifeline.
Yeah.
At this point, so I'm almost 85, and the body gets old and has a lot of problems. And my practice daily is a combination of Rolf movement, yoga, and Continuum. And I don't know where I'd be without it. If I leave it for a few days, I can already feel it. So it's at this point in my life, as my body ages, it is my lifeline. And I love it. I mean, when I first had my first sessions with Maria Byron in 1972, 3 it was, I was so excited. I would practice for an hour and I would be practicing all day long. And then I would be, oh, how does this work in the kitchen? And how does it bend over and pick up a pan? And how do you use your body weight when you cut a carrot? And how do you navigate around this obstacle in the kitchen? Just playing with all of that was so exciting, and it's still exciting. I mean, I think that for me, it's a spiritual practice. It's a spiritual practice in being present. And when I'm not present is when I stumble, literally. And so, yeah, it's embodying it is really what we're trying to guide people to do, is to really live this stuff. And when they do it, then there's a grace that comes. And I mean that word in the fullest sense.
Yeah. Well, sorry. Go on.
Yeah, I was married to a theologian, Sam Keen, for many years. I married him when I was 18. And we were at the seminary where he taught and so forth. And there was a lot of theology floating around. And I became very bewildered, but I was also a dancer. And so I became very bewildered by this word grace. And when I started studying Rolf movement, I got it. I went, oh, it's the same thing. Because being in grace with God is being in harmony with God's will. And being in grace in your body is being in harmony with gravity. And it's the same. And one person said one time, gravity is the expression of God's love. I really like that. I think I put that in that article that you liked too.
Yeah, I like that article. I'm going to share that out for people listening. I'll put it out. One of the things, and I think people listening can hear, you are a great storyteller. And I think and so you wrote this article, maybe others for Rolf Lines. You've also, we won't have time necessarily to get into it, but you've also written other books. And it's amazing because you're
4 novels.
Yeah.
I'm just finishing the first draft of my 5th one. Yeah, no.
You're beyond just so fascinating and amazing. But there was something I was going to say before that kind of ties a lot of the beginning into actually the middle and where we just were about that. When you were talking very earlier about, when people sit back and forward and essentially we're finding presence in that line in the middle, my first thought was of Buddhist thought, right? Of being in the moment, being in the present. And when you start to look at more like Mahayana Buddhism, there's a sense of of loving kindness. Well, you have loving kindness in Theravada as well, but that loving kindness, that may all beings be free, that sense of when we're in the present, we are full of love. There's that loving compassion that just exudes. And I feel like that really ties it all in, that when we are present, when we are on our line, and when we're moving within that, we're moving within grace, or I'm not religious, so God's love doesn't resonate with me, but the same thing, we're moving within loving awareness, which I think you could tie to be the same sort of thing.
I'm sort of, my theology is a little not too conservative anymore, but no, I'm mostly Buddhist in my practice now, but that unconditional love, whether you call it God's love or just spirit love or whatever your words, the words don't matter. I'm
right.
a fundamentalist,
Well, I think we can all agree that, and I feel this with both the Rolfing structural, but maybe a little bit more with the Rolf movement, because there's a little bit more dialogue, but we're really helping people, our clients, find that self-love, especially when we're asking to go into self-inquiry and look into introspection. And, we've had some of those clients where it's really easy and that's really accessible and they can dive right in. And then we have those clients that are like, I don't feel anything. What are you doing? But they walked off the table. They're showing better efficiency in their movement. And although we can see that there's greater change that's happened, the end goal is not because, pat ourselves on the back, we got them moving, but they get to own it and they really get to feel it. And having that kind of challenge with some of those clients that haven't been, that deep dive within isn't readily available, to start getting them into that place. And I think when we get to stay, and I've been doing a lot more reading about somatic awareness, but when we get that first person point of view and that's our truth, and we get to own that, and no one else can say, that feeling you have isn't really true, that you really get to play in your own sensations, your own feeling, your own being, and be okay with it, and maybe feel something that's not working with you, but then honor the other parts that just that one little cranky spot in your body isn't your whole entire body. You got other things in your body that are working well with you. Yeah. But that gets tricky because pain can be the big barker, and that's the only thing you hear. And I think when we get to have the opportunity to coach our clients and guide them and be of support to go into that deep dive within themselves, they get to, how can you not start to love yourself when you're in that place? And when we get clients that are owning that and walking and leaving our treatment room and out in the world and living in that space, the world can be much peaceful. The Rolfing work can create the revolution of one love.
Yeah, really, really. Yeah, we used to have a sort of a chant that we would say, this is back in the 70s also, Rolf the Pentagon, just so that what if all those soldiers came down from their tight chests? Maybe they wouldn't feel so much like killing, but of course that would be undermining the Pentagon, which was...
But that was the plan in the 70s, to undermine the Pentagon.
Really. Those were interesting times. And these are indeed very interesting times where we are now with the virus and the protests and all that.
Well, I'd like to think a lot of good is going to come out of this time, but from a bodywork, somatic, sensory place, I'd like to think that there's going to be a big change because people are going to, in my mind, in the Rolfing communities, we hear about people who's already their clients are saying, I need to see you, that people have recognized, having not been touched, having maybe not moved in certain ways in so long, that the need is there. On the counterpoint, because a lot of people are stuck at home, they're on yoga classes, Zumba classes, Feldenkrais classes. There is somewhat of a sense of people tapping into that more. Now, my lens is colored in that field because I'm so immersed in it that I see it more. But I do see a lot of non-somatic awareness people who are like common working people who never really get massage are doing yoga, and it might not be as somatically based, but it's still, the thing I love about yoga is even if you're doing it just for the exercise, you're getting more. You may not recognize it, but you're getting more, and it can sneak up. It snuck up on me. I was purely physical yoga. When I did my first yoga training, I never ohmed. I said, none of that spiritual shit. I'm just here, good exercise. Flash forward, my yoga is mostly meditation now. It's like, it sneaks up on you.
Right. Well, the other thing that's happening is so many people are outside. And because they're connecting to nature. So many people. I mean, Nikki, do you say you live near the lake also?
Yeah, I am. I'm just right down the road.
It's been so crowded. This Sunday I went and it wasn't quite so crowded. I think now that more things are opening up, but yeah, it's been so crowded there. And
I know. We had to take a break because we were, it's our stomping ground. And like literally I'm a block away. And when the start of the pandemic, it was so crowded. Like, and you can't really do social distance on those trails. So we kind of stopped, unfortunately, going. And now we could just go first thing in the morning.
Well, I was there Sunday and it wasn't so bad anymore. But so there is that change coming where people are, and as I walk to the lake, I live I live about a half mile. As I walked to the lake the other day on Norwood going north and going west there was a little rock by the side of the path that said, "Till we hug again." So the children have been painting rocks and putting messages out all along that walkway. And that was when I went, yes, I want to hug my grandchildren again. And
one thing with that similar thing is, so I'm currently at my parents' house outside of Boston. And whenever I come home, I always go for walks. And I'm always amazed at how unfriendly people are. It's a New England thing kind of, but I'm very much, when I see people, I say hi. And usually in my neighborhood, people are like, why are you talking to me? And now, because people are stuck in their house, it is so amazing. You see them out on walks. Everyone's like, hello, I've never seen you before. But, they're so dire for that connection that I
grew up in New England. I grew up just outside of Boston. So I lived in Melrose for 10 years from the time I was 7 to 17. And then my parents moved to Natick.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I went to Boston University and Harvard and was, after I married Sam, we lived in the city more, but.
So that I don't want to stereotype, but that mentality that I've worked my whole life to still try to move beyond. My pattern is that New England mentality that I'm working to.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're at the end of our hour. Is there more we should say to wrap this up, or?
No, I mean, I think the problem is that Nikki and I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours and hours, but we want to respect you and your time.
I could talk about Rolf Movement forever, but I've said a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. We're so grateful to have you on. It's been the highlight. When we spoke last night on Zoom, it was so nice to see you again, and it's really nice to. I have so many positive words. I'll just cut it off because I'm going to sound like a little blubbering schoolboy.
Well, I wanted to thank you so much for taking time to speak with us, and I will look forward to seeing you around the lake or at Lucky's or in the neighborhood.
Yeah, right.
And I'm so grateful for you raising your daughter the way you have, because I learned so much from my final training with her.
Yeah, Layla's a gift. She's one powerful alpha woman too. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you, Heather. Have a great night there.
You too.
Bye.
Now, bye-bye to both of you.
Bye-bye.